friends, welcome to Pour Over Books. I'm Will, and this is my channel. Today I'm reviewing a book that I mentioned in my August wrap-up, which is Dead Collections by Isaac Fellman. This is one of the best books I've read so far this year. Let's get into it. So this is a new adult, low fantasy, sort of literary fiction, low-key horror kind of book. It's very hard to place it into a category. It mostly goes off of vibes. The vibes are grieving, coming to terms with your past, growth, and the experience of othering. So like, you know it's gonna be a book for the queer kids. You know. It is set in a big city in Northern California, and the main setting is an archive where our main character Saul is working. Most of our time is spent beneath the ground in this archive. We have two main characters. There's Saul. He is a vampire and an archivist and a trans man, and he has basically given up on his entire life just to be an archivist who lives in the archives. It's not technically allowed for him to live in the archives. He's supposed to, go home like everyone else, but instead he just lives in the office, does archivist things, and fights with his coworkers. He struggles a lot with, being a vampire sucks. He can't go out into the daylight, and he sort of hates that. And he struggles with being a trans man in that he's feeling very othered from his coworker, and his vampirism and his identity as a transgender man sort of goes hand in hand in this, that they interplay each other. They're literally in the text connected as he medically transitions through the blood that he gets, which is such an interesting thing. The other main character is Elsie. She is a recent widow, and she comes to the archives so she can donate all the papers that belong to her late wife. And her late wife was a television writer who wrote for like a fantasy sci-fi show. Saul is one of Elsie's wife's fans, and Saul and Elsie immediately have this kind of connection where they both sort of understand, oh, I am queer, you are queer, I think you're attractive, let's go out sometime. And then things sort of unravel from there. The plot, in the word of my wife, who also recommended me this book, by the way, but in the word of my wife, the plot boils down to these two characters who spend their life constantly avoiding doing things because they're afraid of making things worse. Suddenly, one day, the worst thing that they can imagine happened to them, and they have to deal with the consequences. And they realize that as they're dealing with the consequences, the worst thing that they could imagine happening is survivable, which is such a beautiful message. Hello, that is so good. I'm gonna be talking a little more about the actual plot later in my spoiler section. First, I just want to talk about some of the other things that happen throughout the book. Non-spoiler, obviously. There are a lot of really cool things going on in this book. In addition to the regular novel things unfolding from the viewpoint of Saul, there are also parts from like a screenplay about our main characters. There's a part of a screenplay that Elsie's wife Tracy wrote. There is emails, there are letters, there are a lot of these little snippets from people's lives that are pierced together to sort of make up the whole. Specifically because Saul works as an archivist, and because so much of this book circles around the archive and comes back to the archive, it makes complete sense that this book is like an amalgamation of things stacked on top of each other. Literally in the first chapter, Saul is talking about how it fits perfectly that he's an archivist and a vampire, because being a vampire is somewhat like being an archive and vice versa. And it's becomes so interesting when you get to see Saul's life sort of unravel on the page alongside Elsie's life and Tracy's life. All these little pieces of their life get stacked up as if they're in like an archive file. Specifically for Tracy, who is dead as the book is unfolding, we see these little pieces of Tracy's life, from like her letters to one of her lovers that she was cheating on Elsie with. We see parts of the show that she wrote. We see parts of a novel that she wrote. We see all these little bits and pieces. We never hear anything from her directly. We only hear about her from Elsie, or we hear something that she has written, which means that you never really get a sense of her as a complete character. You just get interpretations. And in the end, you only get interpretations of all of the characters because all of the characters are filtered through Saul's perspective, and he, I would assume, filters himself, and it's like a play on reliability. Makes me very excited. I feel like I can just keep peeling back layers on this book, and it's just going to be more interesting every time. There are also a lot of fandom discussions that sort of ties into what I was saying about Tracy being a scriptwriter for a sci-fi show. It ties a lot into fandom. Both Saul and Elsie used to be in fandom, and they talk about it. In the book, Elsie, the character, is actually on the board for Archive of Our Own, which is one of the biggest fan fiction sites currently. They talk a lot about how fandom helped them figure themselves out, how writing fan fiction and reading fan fiction sort of help them understand themselves, how even after they've sort of left the fandoms of their past behind, these fandoms sort of still shape them into the people that they are, which I recognize a lot in my own life. I used to be very into certain fandoms, I used to be very into certain shows, movies, books, and then suddenly I'm not anymore, but I still carry those little bits and pieces around with me. The book also talks a bit about how hard it can be to be a part of a community. There are a couple of different scenes in which the communities that these characters are part of either embrace them or reject them entirely. And it's all based on knowing sort of the rules of the group and of the community that you are a part of. So when one of the characters enters a space in which they have no concept of the rules because they've never actively engaged with this group before, they get incredibly harshly punished for it. And it feels so recognizable to me, especially having been a queer teenager and having been a queer teenager online. There's always the danger of acting and reacting in the wrong way and being ostracized and pushed out, even though you're already ostracized and pushed out and you thought that you could find some sort of relief in this community. And then you have the other side of it where Saul meets another trans man and they just talk about being trans and they just completely understand what the other person's going through in this very innate sense of, oh, we're in this boat together. And it was so beautiful, and so much of this book was talking to me. It felt like it was talking to me directly. I know I was reading a lot of reviews for this book just as I finished it. I like hearing other people's opinions, and on Storygraph there were a couple of reviews that were talking about how this book didn't treat like the lesbian characters in it very well. It didn't treat the women in it very well, and I thought it was interesting because I just didn't read that at all. There were especially a lot of people talking about, because author of this book, Isaac Fellman, is a trans man, so all of the things he's writing about, it comes through very well in the text that he has some form of experience with it. Some of the lesbian characters, because there are multiple lesbian characters in this book, some of the lesbian characters sort of push Saul on the fact that he isn't actually trans and he's actually just a butch woman and he shouldn't have transitioned, etc., etc. And some of these women are sort of pushing this a little hard. And sometimes it seems that it comes from ignorance, sometimes it seems that it comes from their own insecurity in themselves, sometimes it's not really stated, but it's a shitty thing that Saul has to go through. And it's very obvious that it's something that happens in queer communities. There's always going to be transphobia in queer communities. Hopefully not. Actually, knock on wood. Dear God. One day they will no longer... Oh, hi! Honey has come to say hi. She also says that one day there will no longer be transphobia in queer communities. Inter-community politics are so complicated and tricky, and it's not like there is an easy or simple answer to anything. Right, you know it. Yes. This book has a few lesbians that are transphobic, but I don't think it makes the book lesbophobic. I don't think that means that the book is treating lesbians poorly. I think it means that some lesbians are going to be transphobic. And the part that a lot of trans people experience is that some lesbians are transphobic and some gay men are transphobic and a lot of people are transphobic. I feel like what it comes down to in the end, and why I really enjoyed this book versus the people who didn't enjoy it, is that to me it felt like all the characters were given grace. Even the characters who were transphobic or gross in general, the people who treated Saul shittily. The book very clearly stated their points. A lot of it I felt was, you could sort of see where it was coming from. You could see where the character was coming from. You're like, I'm not sure if I agree, but the character was still given the room to have that opinion, and sometimes they would be given room to be like, oh, I was wrong. And writing a lesbian who is transphobic doesn't, no. This book was much more than that. Hopping into the spoiler section, I would suggest reading it before watching the spoiler section, but you do you. I don't know your business. If you're never gonna pick this up, totally cool. And I don't think knowing any of the spoilers will ruin your experience. I think it might just be interesting to not. Sorry about the weird cut and the change in lighting and everything. I realized after I was done filming that I haven't even properly talked about like the plot of the book, so this is after a little break. Let's talk about the plot. So yeah, the worst thing imaginable happens to these two characters. Saul loses his job because someone finds out that he's living in the office, and so he loses not only his job but also his home. And then Elsie is terrified of driving, and specifically driving on the highway, and she's terrified of the idea of getting in a car crash, and then she gets in a car crash. And so it's just these two characters living these horrible experiences that they've dreaded basically their entire lives, and then they survive through it. Saul has to find a new place to work and a new place to live, and in the end, he ends up living with Elsie. Elsie is in the hospital for a few weeks, and then they come out of the hospital and they're fine. And as for Saul's job, in the end, he ends up working with, he starts doing, okay. At the end of Saul's period of working at the archives, he starts discovering very weird things going on with the archives. It's almost like it's haunted. Things are decaying a lot faster than they should be. Things are disintegrating, turning into goo and slime when they shouldn't. Both him and Florence can feel this sort of presence whenever they're in the archives. And Florence blames Saul because Saul's a vampire and Florence is sort of a shitty person. Florence immediately blames Saul because she doesn't like Saul. And then Saul does all this research and finds out this is a common thing that happens in archives where vampires work, as sort of like a chain reaction, where the more time a vampire spends in an archive, the faster it starts disintegrating. It's almost like the meeting between the dead things of the archives and the dead being that is the vampire. Like, still a human, but just like a dead human. And the two of them meeting causes this reaction that makes almost like time and death accumulate faster, which is an interesting concept. They describe it much better in the book, of course, and I don't remember what they call it in the book, but it has like a specific name, and Saul sort of slowly uncovers this. He reaches out to this Facebook group of other archivist vampires, and they're all telling him that, like, oh yeah, this is a common thing, this happens a lot. Yeah, we don't really know anything. And he's like, what do you mean you don't really know anything? And then he starts doing very intense research. He finds out that if you sort of get through the backlog of the archiving, then the effect goes away. It's almost like you're laying the dead to rest, right? Because you're archiving all these items that were left behind from the dead, and by putting them into the system, by going through them and processing them and cataloging them, you appease their souls and put them to rest. And so at the end of the book, he's living with Elsie, but he takes weeks to go travel to other places and work as an archive exorcist, which I think is delightful. I love the parallel of like going through the backlog and cataloging the leftover collections, between that and like dealing with your own trauma, and both Saul and Elsie having sort of to uproot themselves and clean up their feelings. Both of them need to go to therapy, but it's very explicitly stating that by just like leaving the things from your past and leaving the trauma and the experiences and the feelings in a box set aside is just gonna make it fester and get worse and keep haunting you. And so I loved how this book dealt with that, sort of encouraging us and the characters to go through their things and deal with it. And I think in the end, that's why Saul and Elsie can actually be happy now, because they've really dealt with the things that they had to deal with and that they've been avoiding for so long. Going off of what I was saying, Florence is a lesbian, and she's several times stated as a butch lesbian, and Florence and Saul do not like each other at all. We never really figure out why. Florence a lot of the time is just sort of harsh towards Saul. Saul is sort of snappy back, and their animosity keeps building up, and they just don't get along. Florence is sort of transphobic. Saul also acts sort of shitty because he is living at the office and he leaves things around that he shouldn't be leaving around, and both of them have very obvious, clear reasons to not be happy with the other person. I really enjoyed their ending in that they sort of finally get to have this conversation. They work together on like this one final project of finishing up cataloging and organizing Tracy's items, and then they have one final conversation where they're like sort of understanding each other, and then Tracy says, "I never want to talk to you again." And I love that they got to sort of end it off on this like maybe they could have become friends note, and then they just chose to not become friends because some people just aren't meant to be in your life. And that's okay. You don't have to treat everyone nicely. You don't have to be everyone's best friend. Sometimes you don't like someone, and then you suddenly understand where they're coming from, and you still don't have to like them. I also really, really enjoyed Elsa's gender journey. How we start with her sort of feeling uncomfortable in her own skin, but also knowing that people find her attractive. So she's just sort of leaning into it, being like high femme, very goth. And then as things progress, finding out that they're more and more uncomfortable with it and not really knowing exactly where on the gender spectrum they fit. And in the end, they figure out that they're sort of gender fluid and then embracing that and living with that. I really liked how sometimes the book would like see the future, because technically the entire book is in past tense and then there are parts that are like in present tense, but it feels more like you're seeing into the future through Saul's eyes. And he would sometimes talk about how Elsa's pronouns are now constantly changing and they choose every morning what pronouns they want to go with, and it was so wholesome. It literally made me cry. Like, as I was reading this, as soon as Saul started changing pronouns when he was talking about Elsie, I teared up because it was such like a beautiful proof of support and understanding. I haven't even talked about their romance. Their romance is cute, like weird, because this isn't a romance book, but it focuses so heavily on the romance, and then just the two of them, how neatly they fit together. I loved it. I loved how tender this book was and how much love there was between these two people. I think I'm gonna leave most of it untouched. The one thing I want to talk about is that I still don't fully understand this book. There are some scenes that I just don't get. I'm probably gonna read it again soon, see if I understand it more, but if you have read it, there's a scene at the Comic-Con where Saul is following around this cosplayer who's cosplaying the same character as him, just sort of in awe of how good the other cosplayer is, while his own cosplay is sort of teenagers for his cosplay kind of thing. And I did not understand that scene at all. I keep thinking about it. It keeps playing over in my mind because there's something about it, Saul just following around this other guy at a Comic-Con. Not talking to him, not saying anything about it, but just following him around for an entire day and then leaving. And there's something about it that sticks with me, and I still haven't figured it out yet. If you have figured it out, please let me know. But otherwise, I'm just gonna keep thinking about it, probably reread it, and see if I can solve that Comic-Con scene mystery. In the end, I gave this book a 4-star, mostly because it hit so many emotional points for me about queerness and otherness, but also growth and healing, and going through the worst possible thing you can imagine, and then being sort of fine with it, having that horrible change be somewhat for the better. I also love that it was pretentious, because it is pretentious. This is an English lit major who just like went off, and I loved every second of it. Being an English lit major myself, I adored it. It was just pretentious enough while also being pointed, and it called itself out on its pretentiousness sometimes. It was very self-aware, and I truly enjoyed that. I love that the characters were allowed to be messy and make mistakes and be wrong and still get the things that they needed in the end or wanted in the end. I love that we get to see these messy queer characters have a happy ending. So good, so tender. I'm probably forgetting a lot of it right now, but It is so good. I would recommend this one for, I don't know, I want everyone to read it, but I think I would specifically recommend it to people who have some sort of tie to like the queer community. If you are somewhere in like the transgender bubble, if you're questioning your own gender, if you don't fully understand the concept gender, this book might help. I know some people went into it expecting a horror, and I want to point out this is not even a little bit of horror book. It's not particularly scary, and the only horror element is the fact that Saul is a vampire, but even that isn't particularly scary. Not very spooky. A little spooky, but not very spooky. I just want to recommend this book to my best friends. Honestly, I'm like, I think you would enjoy this book. Have you read this book? What were your thoughts on it? Did you understand the Comic-Con scene? How do you feel the book treated Florence and Tracy and the other characters who were women and or lesbians? How do you feel that the romance was handled? Did any of this review make sense to you? If you have any questions, concerns, criticisms, requests, let me know down below. Thank you so much for sharing some of your day with me. I hope you take care of yourself. Bye!